Hello, and welcome to the Office of Children's Mental Health Trauma-Informed Care Training. The topic we're exploring in this segment is the collective trauma resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. We're calling this session Collective Trauma 101. I'm Jennifer Smith, Program Coordinator for the Center for Community Health Advancement with Marshfield Clinic Health Systems, and I will be facilitating this Collective Trauma 101 discussion. So joining me today on the panel, we have Scott Webb, Trauma-Informed Care Coordinator for the Wisconsin Department of Health Services, Samia Khan, a mental health therapist at Wholehearted Wellness, and Tracy Loken-Weber, a lived experience partner with the Office of Children's Mental Health. So welcome all of you, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
So we're going to start our discussion by sending it over to Scott and asking him to kind of lay the groundwork for us by defining collective trauma.
Yeah, this is kind of a new term, right? In my trauma-informed training that I do around the state, I've never talked about collective trauma until 2020 happened. So I think it's important for us to name what this is and what we're all going through. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to share this. Collective trauma is a very different type of trauma because it happens not just to to a person or a small group of people. It happens to like entire societies. But in case of COVID-19, it's the entire world. And I think it's really hard for us to get our brains and our emotions around that reality that you can't go anywhere on this planet without encountering the same thing we're all going through with this collective trauma of pandemic of COVID-19. So it really, and the two big pieces of collective trauma that make it kind of unique is this feeling that you can't escape from it. And when you're talking about global, there's no place you can go to get away from it. It's everywhere. And then this feeling this inability to make sense really of what's going on. And I know that when I walk into the store sometimes and I'm wearing my mask, I don't do it very often, but when I do, and I kind of look around, I'm struck constantly with this sense of like, how surreal this is. Like, how did this happen where we're all wearing masks? We haven't had to do this in over 100 years. So there's a lot for us to get our minds around. So what happens with collective trauma is it elicits the psychological trauma in all of us, that it violates our familiar ideas of ourselves and our world. I mean, everything is different. And, you know, we're not in 2019, and after we come out of this, it's still going to be different. So I think we're still trying to understand what that is and what that's going to mean, but it plunges us into the state of extreme confusion and feelings of uncertainty. And so we'll talk more about some other forms of collective trauma, but I think in a nutshell, that would be a quick definition.
Yeah, thank you for that. I agree that it is a little bit surreal as we're walking around in environments and just observing how different things look and feel to all of us. That experience is pretty universal, and being able to talk about it and put a name on it and identify it, I think, is going to help all of us move forward. So one of the questions that we'd really like to address is, how does this impact our children? And how might we see this manifesting as we move forward? So Samia and Tracy, we're going to look to the two of you to kind of kick us off with the discussion on how all of this might be impacting our kids.
Yeah, so the biggest thing that we have to think about is, like, kids are like a sponge. They understand everything. They pick up on the littlest cues, emotional, physical, whatever it might be, even though they might not fully understand what's going on. That can lead to the place of like a bit of a confusion. Like, I don't know what's happening. Like, I'm feeling uneasy. I'm feeling this feeling in my tummy, or even questioning why mom and dad are feeling so worried. But then because they don't fully understand, that fear can become that place of like confusion and being lost. Like, I know something is not okay, but then I don't even know how to put words to it, which can also come out in the place of like, okay, now I know that I'm not going to school in person. I'm doing like, virtual learning, and then going back to school. And then let's say there's another exposure going back home, that can lead to the place of like disruption, and kids really need that stability. So even moving forwards, helping kids like understand, like, yes, stability is important and so much needed, but at the same time, we also need that flexibility to have that space to process what we're feeling, how we're feeling it, and get to that place of understanding what safety even is emotionally and physically.
Awesome, thank you for that. Tracy, do you want to expand maybe a little bit on some of your experiences through this whole time?
Sure. Well, it's been interesting because I come from the world of being an educator for over 25 years. And back then, and it hasn't even been that long since I've been out of the field, we didn't talk a lot about trauma and how to recognize it in children and how to teach a child that's coming from a difficult, hard place. And what does that look like? And then 11 years ago, we became foster parents, my husband and I. And then we were just kind of thrust into this world of holy moly, what is this trauma, and how do we best work with children that have it? And I think right now more than anything, it's really important to give us all a little extra grace and compassion, and really be okay with slowing down. I think that's one thing. If we, reflect on the past year plus of COVID, it was football, volleyball, arts, 4-H, whatever it was, gymnastics, swimming. We're constantly going. And then boom, just like that, everything stopped. And I think it was a really huge cultural shift for so many, because everything that we were doing and running and going to, our families were becoming more and more disconnected. And I think right now, COVID has really helped us all to stop and realize what's really important in life, and that's our health, and that's taking care of one another, and especially right now. So I think when we think about our children and working through their traumas, is being present, listening to them, whether you may or may not agree with what they're saying. These are their feelings, and this is the trauma that they've gone through, and how can we best support them through this process.
Thank you for lifting up the little potential silver lining, right? That some of us have been kind of forced to reevaluate our priorities and refocus on those relationships that are important to us, as a positive means of working through this whole collective trauma that we're living through. So as part of this whole experience and focusing on kids and really helping to support them as we're moving through this process, how do we as adults manage this ourselves? What are some things that we can do to help support kids, to help ourselves, so that we can better support kids as we move through this? So Tracy, do you have some thoughts on that one?
Yeah. Boy, do I have some thoughts. How much time do we have today? I think it's really important. I always thought self-care was selfish. Mm-hmm. And I never fully got it until enter in our home. We have 6 beautiful, resilient, strong children that have come from very difficult places. All of them were foster children, and we adopted them. And they all have significant mental health needs. And so I think more than ever, it's really important to take that time for self-care. And like I just said, give yourself grace. Some nights it's just a cereal night. Some nights it's like we're going to McDonald's, right? But sometimes you just have to make it easy on yourself to meet the needs of the kids in the family in your care. And I can say, as a previous educator, nothing prepared me for this role, but getting into it and living in this role every day. And so just giving yourself some space and some space, and then also, becoming that individual little investigator, reading articles and researching for yourself, and working with some amazing therapists that have that trauma focus and that understand the world you're coming from, because we've worked with therapists that really have no clue. And I honestly, about a month ago, I said to one of our doctors, I said, would you like an internship in our home just for 24 hours? You are more than welcome to come at any point in time, just so you can kind of get a better view of what it's like living with trauma.
That's wonderful. I'm curious. I'm expecting that didn't take you up on that offer, but that would be a great life experience. Mm-hmm. So Samia or Scott, do you have any other thoughts on adults, how do we take care of ourselves, mitigate some of these stressors so that we can be better supports to those around us?
Yeah, I'll just speak from my own personal experience because I kind of was thrust into the world of self-care. I didn't really want to do that. Even as a young adult, I used to do a lot of running and biking and all that. But then life happened and I had kids and they, you kind of get away from all that. Well, I had a widowmaker heart attack about 5 years ago, and it only has a 6% survival rate. So that was really, when I heard that, I'm like, I really dodged a huge bullet. But that threw me into the world of self-care again. So I've learned the value of it just based on what I'd gone through. And even though I was doing this job as a trauma-informed care coordinator and I'm talking around the state, I wasn't really living out all that self-care stuff at the time. So the one cool thing about when you begin to take control over your health and your own well-being, that can be contagious and people can catch that. I know some of my family members have noticed me when I lost a lot of weight in a very short time and I started working out all the time. And they were like, whoa, what's going on? And I just had to tell them, this is really important. This is something that's non-negotiable for me because if I want to be walking this earth and not have another heart attack, I need to take care of myself because I'm in a better position to take care of those around me. So that old adage of putting on your oxygen mask first is really true because we really need to take care of ourselves. And kind of feeding off what Tracy said, a lot of people do sometimes think self-care means selfish, but it's really showing self-interest. That's a big difference. And I remember as a therapist back in the old days, I used to tell my clients that too. So I think that's really important to embrace that self-care and know that that's something you do have control over and it can kind of empower you in really positive ways, even in the midst of all this uncertainty.
Yeah, that's well said. Thank you.
Yeah. And like Scott, one thing that you said that really stuck out to me, including you, Tracy, is like a lot of times parents feel that self-care will be selfish. Like if I'm putting myself first, I'm putting my kids aside or my family members aside, my job aside, when the reality is that is exactly what we need, because sometimes we also have to lead with an example. Because when we even show our family, friends, our children, like, hey, I'm going to therapy, I'm working out, I'm watching what I eat, whatever it might be, we're showing them like, hey, this is the way I'm loving myself. And this is the way you can even love yourself in those moments when life is a little out of control.
Absolutely. And sometimes I just say to my kids, Mom is taking a time out. And I just take a time out. And they're like, okay, stay away. But it's okay to take a break.
Well, and that's some beautiful modeling, right? You're really creating a safe space for kids to be able to say, I'm overwhelmed, because you are saying, I, as the adult, have these feelings too. And this is what I do when I'm feeling that way. So you're really, being this great role model for the kids by practicing those things for yourself. That's awesome. All right, we're going to shift gears a little bit, unless we have any other final thoughts on taking care of ourselves or helping support kids. We're going to shift to start talking a little bit about how we can help to mitigate some of this collective trauma that has really profoundly impacted some communities or groups of people or individuals who are really of the greatest need. Are there things that we can be doing to help with some of those vulnerable communities? How can we help mitigate some of the impacts of what's been going on? And this is kind of a big, heavy lift, I think. So Samia or Scott, do you want to start talking a little bit about some of the communities that maybe have been most impacted during this time?
Yeah, I've noticed, because I tend to work with like predominantly very South Asian Americans or Asian Americans in general. And I've noticed like a next level of fear that's been coming out, especially the way the violence has been happening, is how like the COVID started and how like all of those pieces were happening in our immediate community and as our national community, and how those pieces of fear were so real. And one of the things that I've noticed is like a lot of times people are like starting to feel that they don't feel even safe enough to go outside or safe enough to even reach out to friends, because at times they start to also feel like, am I the only one who's feeling that way? That leads to the place of like, maybe I am not thinking realistically, or maybe it's just all me. And even understanding like how that transgenerational trauma of not being able to have your narrative heard and what that grief that is triggered with like, I'm not safe in this community, like I thought I was going to be safe, but I'm not, and how to even understand what that safety will be like, to hold that space of like sharing that narrative, to feel heard, to feel understood, and coming to the place of even recognizing who the safe support systems are in our society, in our personal life and in our professional and working life.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Samia. And the other thing I want to just kind of bring in here from what I said at the beginning, COVID-19 is one example of what we call collective trauma, but the other piece of it, and Samia touched on a little bit, is the community violence that we're seeing going on around the country. And it's coming up again now with the trial of the officer, former officer in Minneapolis. But I think that the statistics are bearing out that people of color are really being disproportionately affected by the COVID. There's more deaths, there's a lack of resources, and people getting vaccinated, they're lagging behind the rest of the population. So we really need to be looking at this equity and this health equity, looking through that lens. And then the other piece of this would be, you know, with the violence going on, that's a double whammy. There's two different forms of collective trauma going on right now. We have the pandemic, which in and of itself is tremendous, but then we also have the community violence, which is still an issue, the racial fueled violence going on. And other examples of collective trauma would be like genocide and wars. So we're talking about big ticket items, and we're dealing with two of those right now. So we are dealing collectively with a lot of trauma. There's a lot we're dealing with and trying to figure out. So we really can't forget about that equity piece and coming together and figuring out how can we take this opportunity and really begin to question how we are rolling out services and how can we do it in a more equitable way. This is an opportunity that we can't let go.
Absolutely. So any thoughts or suggestions on if we are providers or caregivers for individuals who might be in groups that are experiencing multiple levels of collective trauma, what are some things that we can do to help reach out and support those people that we interact with, that we are supporting or caring for? You know, what can I go out and do and help to support some people in my community who may be experiencing multiple levels of trauma as a result of these, you know, multiple layers of collective trauma that are happening? Any thoughts on that, Samia or Scott?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is just like holding that space and being that safe person and identifying yourself as like whenever you need or whatever you need, what that looks like, and also understanding like culturally how that can look different. So let's say like somebody who even comes from, for example, like let's say Thailand, or like compared to let's say Ireland, that there are two different types of transgenerational traumas that will be triggered. And how can we be there for that person? And even asking at times, like this is one of the things that I do, and I always tell my clients to do at times too, is like asking at times, like, do you need comfort or do you need resolution? To even like set that ground and space of like, what do you need from me in this moment while I hold that safe space for you to have the narrative heard and gain that support that would be the most beneficial.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And that reminds me, in our youth program, one of the first shifts we made when we started transitioning to a more trauma-informed program, we trained the staff to start asking, how can I help you right now? When a child was exhibiting some escalating behavior. And so that whole shift, that this behavior is a result of something that's being triggered in the child that makes them feel overwhelmed or scared or unsafe. And so rather than being directive and saying, you know, you need to sit down or you need to settle down, how can I support you right now? And I think that that lens shift is really important. And if you interact with someone or come across someone who seems agitated, kind of having just that little phrase in mind, you know, how can I help you? Or what can I do to support you right now? That's great perspective. Thank you for that.
And I too want to say, when you're working with children, young children, they might not be able to verbalize how you can help them, but maybe asking like, what happened to you? Then they might be able to explain what happened to them individually, and then they might be able to help process how you can help them. But that's really important because I have 2 children right now that just would become nonverbal, and they would not be able to answer that question.
Yeah, thanks for that perspective, Tracy.
Yeah, I think it's really important too for me, just from my standpoint. I travel the state providing trauma-informed care training, and I've been telling, whether it's work groups or even individuals who are in my training, we talk about, if there was ever a need for trauma-informed, trauma-responsive practice and, interactions, it would be now. The sad thing is there's a lot of people that they don't have the bandwidth to really deal with it sometimes. And I know I'm getting a lot of requests from organizations that are their workforce is stressed out, and they're providing services to kids and to families and to others around our state. And they're saying, we want to complete our mission, but our own staff right now is going through this collective trauma, and we are really struggling ourselves. And I've had requests, even when this is over with, when I can get back out on the road, is doing debriefings with provider groups that they want to kind of process their own stuff about this, because there's been a lot of grieving, there's been a lot of loss around this, even though there are some opportunities we've talked about. But I think that we need to be okay with talking about this and bringing this out. That's why having this conversation about what is collective trauma, at least we're naming it, and we're trying to put some understanding around that, because that's when we can begin to, when we name it and we can begin to think about, we're all in this together, that we can be thinking that we're not making this journey by ourselves, and that the way we get through this when this pandemic begins to fade is by coming together. And hopefully we can do that in a hope and intention as I get back on the road later this year, maybe next year, and start talking about the next phase of this pandemic and this collective trauma.
Absolutely. How do we move forward? That's a tough question, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of this whole broad concept of collective trauma, as we kind of come to a close with our discussion, is there a little tidbit of information that each of you would like to share on this broader topic with the audience who will be watching this panel discussion? So Samia, how about we start with you? Not to put you on the spot.
Okay. So the one thing that I do definitely want people to remember is don't ever be ashamed of even labeling that I'm not doing okay, because the reality is nobody is doing okay, and that within itself is okay. And if that means that you need to reach out to your support system, get established with a provider, whatever that might be, it is okay for you to do that, because you also deserve that love and support that you want to give everybody else.
That's a great reminder. Thank you. Tracy.
And I would also agree with that too, is that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to talk to a trusted friend or relative, spouse, caregiver, and someone that you feel safe with, right? And then also at this time, just remember to show extra grace and compassion to everybody you come into contact with, because you just don't know what they are going through individually. And even if it's a clerk at a store or a receptionist when you're doing a telehealth visit or something like that, just give that extra grace and compassion to everybody right now, especially yourself.
Thanks for that, Tracy.
And I'm just gonna quote a friend of mine, Lynn McLaughlin, who said this, and I thought it was really good. She said that during this pandemic, anything that you're capable of, nothing, something, everything, whatever you're capable of doing right now is enough. It's okay. And just taking small steps every day is going to be, or every minute or every whatever. Just know that, kind of feeding with what Samia and Tracy said, it's okay not to be okay, and we need to be okay with that, be vulnerable, be real, and just know that whatever I'm capable of that day is going to be what I'm capable of, and I'm okay with that.
We all need to internalize those messages. Thank you so much for sharing that. So with that, we're going to end our panel discussion on collective trauma as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, thank you so much to Scott and Tracy and Samia for being a part of the panel and participating in this discussion. And thank you all who are taking the time to view this recording. We appreciate you taking the time to learn and develop your own knowledge and understanding.
Thank you.